Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigers.
Welcome everyone to the very latest Fly Culture Podcast. I'm Pete Tigers. I hope you've been enjoying these podcasts through these times where we can't fish. This one's actually being recorded at the very end of April. There may be a glimmer at the light of the tunnel, but we'll have to wait and see. But I hope everyone's staying safe. I hope everyone's keeping and fit as healthy as they possibly can. And as I've always said on these things, that I hope these are the next best thing to being out on the river. Thank you again for everyone contacting me and saying how much they're enjoying the podcast. As ever, if you have any suggestions of people you think might be interesting to interview, drop me a line and I'll be very happy to look at that. Today, we're doing another transatlantic podcast. I'm talking to Nick Yardley. He left Yorkshire in the UK to work in the US as a climbing guide, but ended up working in fly fishing and is currently president of Fulling Mill USA. I plan to learn about his life prior to moving to the US, the fishing he did in Yorkshire, and how he settled stateside and the differences between the fishing that he experiences now in the US comparable to the UK. So I think this is going to be a really, really interesting one to listen to. Nick, it's great to have you here. How's it going?
It's going well, thanks, Pete. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. And how's everything over there? Obviously, as we talked about, you're out in the US. How's the sense of everything there? How are you doing? Are you in lockdown? I guess if you are, you're unable to fish right now.
We are in lockdown in Vermont, where I live. We are actually allowed to fish. So last night I was fishing in a snowstorm. Results were pretty minimal, but at least I was out. Depends on the state you're in, but we are allowed to fish, not in groups or anything. I live in a pretty nice place, small country village in a log cabin in the woods. So very quiet, not a lot of population base around. So for me, lockdown's quite relaxing, actually.
You're just carrying on as normal, I guess.
Pretty much.
Yeah. And so how is the fishing that time of year? Are you sort of fishing dries? Are you fishing a nymph, a dry dropper? How are you actually approaching the streams right now?
With a lot of clothing on because it's quite cold. New England, where I live, we're iced down right through the winter and things are just opening up now. In Vermont, we have Lake Champlain, which has a lot of tribs going into it. Those open up first, generally, depending on the year, late March, early April. And there we're chasing landlocked salmon. We're either swinging small trout spey rods or we're nymphing from. I love to swing the spey rods. So I'm generally chasing landlocked salmon early in the season. Now those tribs, the salmon will probably start going out and we'll start having the big bass coming in. And these bass are big and they make trout look feeble creatures. I mean, a 5-pound bass on a 5 weights is, like hooking a tap, and it's amazing. As for trout rivers, depending exactly where you are in the state, the big browns are waking up. No real stocking's gone on yet in the state, but resident browns are up for the giving. The water's very cold, so it's definitely down deep with nymphs and big streamers. There ain't no dry fly action going on yet. That won't really come until May or June.
That's a lovely mix of fishing you've got on your door. Do you have a particular favourite? I know you said out the back of your cabin there, you've got a stream running down there. Mm-hmm. Do you have a particular favourite?
I mean, I love it all. I mean, it depends a little on the season. In the height of summer, when the big rivers close down because of the heat, I really love chasing brook trout up high in the White Mountains, the Green Mountains, and the Adirondacks. In early June, I love going onto the coast of Maine and chasing stripers off the rocks and the estuaries. June, May, I love chasing the big browns in the rivers. And then obviously poppers on lakes for bass, I love, and then sneaking up to Canada for a bit of salmon fishing. I mean, we have so much opportunity and variety here that you can just switch it up all the time. But deep down, darkest passion, I would say, is brook trout high in the mountains.
That's really nice timing as our readers will get the chance to see an article you've written for us that will come out in the summer edition of Fly Culture called Blue Lining. And it's about you heading up high and catching because brook trout are just probably up there for one of the most beautiful fish there are as well, aren't they? They're absolutely stunning.
Oh yeah, I mean, for me, they are the most beautiful fish. I mean, I'll catch one, hold it just under the water in my finger, and I've caught so many, but yet I'll still just stare at them and go, wow, this is amazing. This is a jewel. This is not a fish. This is a gem. Always impressed.
There's so many different aspects of the dark mouth, the white piping on the fin. There's so many aspects of them that make them truly beautiful, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. And, you can go from one pool to next, and a shallower pool, there'll be brighter color. You go into the pool up higher, they're a little darker, and there may only be 25 feet separating the two fish.
Yeah. And are they a fish? They don't grow particularly big, do they? Is that a similar sort of case from the streams that you fish for?
In the streams I generally fish for, if I go over into Maine, if I go into the Rangeley area, you can catch big fish. You can catch 2, 3, 4-pound brook trout, and they're caught regularly. But the streams I go in have a short growth period. I go up high into the White Mountains where they're still locked down in ice and snow at the moment, and then they'll really start opening up. For me, the opening day is July 4th is when I head up there, hide my English accent and head up there on July 4th. And up there, the fish have a very short growth period, so 10-inch fish is a monster. Most of the fish you're catching are probably 6 to 8 inches. If you really go up, get off the beaten path, you can catch a lot of fish. All dry fly action for me. And when I'm fishing that, I have a 2-weight, 7.5-foot 2-weight, and basically I fish with a foam beetle most of the time, and just keep going on up the drainage.
That sounds absolutely fantastic and right up my street as well. Light line fishing for those little fish.
Oh, love it.
And like you say, they're absolutely stunning to look at as well. I absolutely adore them. So we're going to take you back across the Atlantic shortly. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned July though there, and we don't really have that to contend with, but obviously you have runoff, and perhaps some of our listeners won't understand or know of runoff and how that affects fishing in the US. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, and we're such a vast country, so runoff affects the West different than here. But on the East Coast where I am, the big rivers now, the White Mountains hold a lot of snow. Tuckerman's Ravine, for example, on the slopes of Mount Washington is a huge ski area. It's completely, not area, but natural ski bowl, holds 100 feet depth of snow, so almost a mini glacier. At the moment, it's closed down because of COVID, so nobody's skiing up there. But all that water has to release out of the mountains. So these little brook trout streams that I love to fish, they're just a roaring torrent now, snow on the banks, and then it'll just be roaring water coming down. So they're not really fishable. I'm sure you could put some 5 mil tungsten beads on and plop them in holes and things, but they're just unfishable. But as that snow goes away, the water level drops and temperatures get good. In the lower, we'll get very warm here in the summer. And so the big rivers in the low valleys, they tend to warm up quite significantly in July and get to a temperature where it's just really too warm to chase trout, unless you're doing it very early in the morning, and sometimes even then. But those high streams, because they've been fed by that snowpack, which has now gone down, drop to a level where the dry flies work really well.
So when that runoff is happening, all that snow melt, do you sort of put a line through fishing, or do you head to the coast? Does that sort of time nicely for the coast for you to chase?
On the East Coast, it's the runoff is now. We don't really see the stripers arriving on the coast of Maine until, we always think it's going to be a little earlier, but it never is. It's always basically the first week of June, and by then, most of the major runoff has gone down. For me, those high rivers are still too high to fish for brook trout with a dry fly. I could fish with them with a nymph then, or little streamers, but that's not why I do that. So it's still too high. So the big rivers, even though the flow is up, they're generally very fishable, and then the coast doesn't come in until really June.
And the stripers, just while we're on those, because we mentioned those a little bit as well, I was reading something yesterday that there are some places where there are almost flats that you can pole. Oh, yeah. That sounds absolutely amazing.
Yeah, we got sections on the coast of Maine. Cape Cod is probably the most famous, where you are literally walking the flats, or you're on a boat on the flats, and you're watching a school come in just as you would with bonefish, and you're tagging them exactly as you would with a bonefish, but they're a whole lot bigger. I think the striper fishing on the coast of Maine, all down New England, but for me, I know the coast of Maine, it can be phenomenal. It can change from year to year. I mean, you can have years where I've had days in early June where I've just put down the fly rod because I've just caught so many fish I don't want any more. I've had other days where, I've caught 3 or 4, and so it's not been a great day. But it can be a phenomenal fishery. The smaller or schoolie fish generally come in June, and then the bigger fish later in the summer. I love fishing late at night in the dark. A lot of people don't like that, but I really enjoy that, and that's where the big fish can come out. And it's beautiful. They're all natural. They're super strong fish, and it's not like fishing for bass off the coast of Britain where, a few fish here and there is a really big day. I mean, we can have really big days of a lot of fish.
Wow. And what sort of sizes do these fish actually get to?
The schoolies are generally in the 18 to 26 inch range. Very strong fish. And then they can go right up to, fishing from the shore. We're generally not fishing with fly rods from the shore. We're generally not going much above 34, 36 inches, but that's a big fish. And then they can go right up, in boats off the coast. They can go right up to 40, 50 pounds. But that's not what we're really targeting with the fly rod.
Wow. Wow, they sound absolutely phenomenal. That flat thing, as I said, it's always been on my sort of list of things that I'd love to tick off one day. I think my days of running after rooster fish have gone now. But that sounds fascinating to me. And they're, again, another beautiful fish as well.
Very much so.
Something I'd really like to explore one day, and hearing that you could fish for them in a flat style sounds absolutely phenomenal too.
Well, I know a guy whenever you come across.
Yeah. So let's take you back to Yorkshire and where everything started for you. Whereabouts were you? Where did fishing come in? How did that all start for you?
Well, initially we lived up in North Yorkshire in a little place called Hutton Rugby. My home was on about half a mile from the River Leven, and as kids, my mum would let us out the door when literally 5 years old. A group of us would go down as a pack and we'd play in the river. And I remember one day going up a little below the bridge, there's like a little weir, and I remember walking up the side of it, and I saw this, it must have been just a minnow, but like a 2-inch fish trying to get up this weir, and I was just absolutely fascinated by it. And I just left the group of kids, and I just sat there and watched this little fish going up the weir. And then some type of light bulb went off, and then every time I crossed the bridge, I would look up the river, and I'd see trout in the river. And, none of my friends were interested in fishing. Nobody in the family was interested in fishing. My brother wasn't interested, but something just stuck, and I just had to get down there and go fishing.
So how did you go, not having, and, being as a similar sort of age as yourself as well, that those days it would be a parent usually would take you along. How did you suddenly decide you wanted to go in the river and catch some fish? How did that happen for you?
Well, we had an uncle from Canada coming across, and he neglected to buy, we'd never seen him before. I was maybe at this time I was maybe 6 or so. And he'd neglected to bring a present with him. So my mum said, you need to get him something. So we went to Walmart or Kmart, I think it was, and he bought myself and my brother this tiny little Shakespeare outfit, spinning rod and a reel and some hooks and some weights. And, nobody in our family fish. My brother said he'd come down with me. He had a rod. I'd watched a couple of anglers down there fishing, and I'd somehow managed to tie a hook onto the line, put some weight on, put a worm on. And I remember arching back to make my first cast, and because I'd seen guys doing it, and launch forward. And then there was an almighty scream, and the line behind me, the hook had fallen to the top of my brother's head, caught his scalp. And as I pulled forward, the hook of the worm drove into his head. And that was about the last time he ever fished. Once we extracted the hook, I got out there, and I can't remember if it was that day, but early on I did catch a trout, and it was probably, 10 or 12 inches. And I remember running home with it and giving it to my mom, and she cooked it up for dinner, and it was just super special. But everything was just working it out by myself. There was nobody that fished. Eventually I ended up hooking up with a buddy down the road, a guy called John Lamb, and we ended up fishing together. But really it was just all getting on the river, seeing what worked, and just fumbling through and taking forever to work it out.
And was it one of those things that when you started doing it, you caught that fish, that was it, you immediately knew this was something you loved? Or did it take time? Did it fit in with other things, or did you know pretty quickly?
I knew before I even caught the fish. I mean, the first time I was playing in that river and I was seeing those trout in there, I was like, this is me. This is what I was going to do. And so even before I cast the line, I knew I was hooked, and I just had to get that line. Then I became, just like we all do, I just became obsessed, and that's what mattered. And then when we were about, I can't quite remember the age, but maybe 8 or 10, something like that. Maybe I think probably 8 or so. We moved to Ripponden in West Yorkshire near Sowerby Bridge, and much more of an industrial environment. And so we were fishing the River Ryber and Calder. And again, I was just fishing on my own. Those types of rivers, they would often run purple with dye extract and, sewage and things. But, I was as happy as a clam down there chasing fish and, catching quite a lot of fish. Got into the coarse fishing side of things heavily as you did then. Spent, my 5-hour matches as a 12-year-old on the Rochdale Canal, freezing my butt off with the roach pole out, doing all that, doing that type of stuff. And, enjoyed every minute of it. And then there was a certain moment in life where fly fishing really took over. I mean, I can tell you that if you like, or...
Yes, please. That was my next question.
Okay.
So where did fly fishing come into it, and how really?
Well, I mean, I was always fishing, but I didn't really understand what fly fishing was. And so it was much easier just to put a worm out there. Very similar to how we Euro-nymph now, because I was actually using a fly rod for a lot of it, because that's just what happened to be. I happened to find line around somewhere. But, most of my fishing was match fishing on the canals and River Calder. Then my mother went to nursing school with a woman called Janet Teasdale, who happened to be the wife of Harry Teasdale, who, I don't know if you're aware of that, but was quite a famous riverkeeper down in Dorset. I didn't know him from Adam or anything. One family vacation, we went down there and we camped in their front yard for a week. And Harry knew that I was big into fishing, and he volunteered to take me out for a day on the River Allen, which was his river. And we took his little rod out, and he took me on the river. I didn't know what casting was and things. And he took me under his arm for that day. That was the only day I had with him. And I watched him casting effortlessly to some beautiful big browns, catching them. He put me in some weird pools. I caught a bunch of fish, and that was it. I got home, went to the local fishing shop, swapped out all my coarse fishing gear for a couple of fly rods and beats up reels and lines, and then the rest is history.
Can you remember what you bought, what rods you were buying? And
well, let me see. I got 2 rods for all my stuff I traded in, and they basically just happened to be what was there. One was like a 10.5-foot boat rod from Bruce and Walker, which was totally inappropriate for what I was doing. But I had it. That's what they had in the shop. And then I got something that was probably around an 8.5-foot 6-weight or something, which was fine, which was good. On that, and then I ended up making a rod of myself. I made a rod, and it was a 10-foot 7-weight. And when I fished the reservoirs, that was the sort of go-to stick on that.
What reservoirs were you fishing then?
Up there, I was fishing Ryburn Reservoir, which was a little club, private club up there. You could get day tickets on it. But when I went to school, I had a games teacher who was a fanatical fisherman, a guy called Alex Smith, who you may know of. And he used to fish the loon a lot, and he wanted to start a fly fishing club. But the reason he wanted to start a fly fishing club basically was so then he could use the school van to go up to the loon, fish nights and that. And I think there was myself and one other kid called Richard Barker that were actually in the fly fishing club, and he never solicited any more people than that because it was convenient to manage 2 of us when we went fishing. So he was a huge influence. The reservoir was close to the school, and he managed to get me into the reservoir. I don't think it was particularly hard to get into, but I didn't know about it. And he got me into it, and it was a great place. I could just be dropped off there, ride my bike, or walk up there after school and just fish all the time. And it was kind of cool. There was a sign-in book, where you'd sign in the number of fish you caught. And as I was fishing there all the time, I had a lot of sign-ins. I never realized that, there was plenty of really good fishermen there, but they fished once a week, so they didn't have many fish in the book. I fished 5 times a week, so I had more fish in the book. But that was kind of nice. And, it was a high acidic reservoir, but I really enjoyed it and got to know it. And that was sort of, my forming grounds there.
So you were fishing the reservoir 5 days a week. Did that mean that was the direction your fishing at that time was going towards? Was it more still water, or were you actually spending any time on the river with your shorter rod too?
I was spending time on the river. It was more a matter of convenience, because it was so close and easy to get to and so much water to explore. I would still fish the River Ryburn a lot, which was below my house. But, the River Ryburn, I think it was, I can't remember what the license fee was for it, but it was very inexpensive and it was very dirty and full of sewage and at that time dye and stuff. So I would fish it and have a good time down there, but getting into this thing felt very exclusive. It was very special. I think the fishing on the river was just as much fun, but this was an exclusive opportunity that I knew I was lucky to have. So I just milked it for all I could.
And how were you fishing that? Would it been mainly floating line, or were you using sunk line techniques? Were you just mixing everything then?
I read Arthur Cove, and whatever he did, I did. So he was my, yeah. So what he suggested, I did in his book, My Way with, I think it was My Way with Trout, right?
Yep.
And so I had a heavy pheasant tail nymph on the bottom, a couple of buzzers. Sometimes I would fish, a team of wet flies. But basically, how Arthur did it, I did it.
Yeah,
that was very effective.
Got a copy of it just behind me actually, and it's still one of my favorite covers, with a guy there with a fag hanging out the side of his mouth.
And great.
Fishing. Yeah, it's just brilliant book, isn't it?
Yeah, and then later in life, when I learned that he used to fly his microplane to the reservoir to go fishing, that blew my mind.
Yeah. And he's, we talk about the squirmies and stuff like that. He was playing with the red diddy then, wasn't he? With the sort of, I think, was it elastic band type thing that he was using to imitate bloodworm and stuff like that?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, I can't quite remember that. I was totally sold on his pheasant tail nymph and his buzzers there.
And there must have been fun throwing those super long leaders, because he liked long leaders as well, I think, didn't he?
Yeah, and I never had too much a problem with that. I mean, I would use them, but back in those days, it was pretty much a level leader. You wouldn't really be tapering them, and I wasn't using super long, but probably 15, 16 feet. But there was watching the tip of the line and watching it swing and just retrieving really slowly. It was very addictive, and worked really effective on that particular reservoir.
Fantastic. It's interesting because I remember the one foray I had into competitive fishing. I got into one of the many years ago, the Trout Master things, and I was over the moon. And that's exactly how I used to fish, little buzzers or little wet flies, and let the bow in the line and everything else. And then when I'd been taking it, or when I qualified, I fished great big lures and everything, and I fished exactly the way I didn't usually fish. And that was it. That was my one foray into it. And I thought, well, I do this because it's fun and not competitive. That was my one foray into it. But interestingly, at that sort of time, then you had a sort of mentor via teacher and stuff like that. What about time flies? Were you starting to tie those pheasant tails yourself?
Yeah, when Alex started his fly fishing club, I think one of the reasons he started it was because at somewhere he'd purchased or was given a whole bunch of fly tying kit from some estate. I don't know what. So he had these big boxes of fly tying stuff, and so he just divvied it out, and we started tying. Not that we tied in a group, or even he showed us what to do. He just had a lot of stuff and said, "Hey guys, take what you want." And we did. And, I couldn't really buy flies. I wasn't working. I was 12 years old, 13 years old. And so just buying flies was not an option. So I just started tying flies, and I just became addicted, and that's what I would do all the time. And so generally, a lot of wet flies, a lot of black pennels, a lot of black and peacock spiders, a lot of pheasant tail nymphs, that type of stuff. And then I just always tie my own flies. I mean, I barely buy a fly, and just love tying.
And so was it, do you remember that first fish that you caught on one of your first flies?
Not particularly, but it was either my guess is it was probably on the Ryburn River. I hadn't started fishing the wharf yet then, so it wasn't on the wharf. So it was probably on the Ryburn River. I don't remember it particularly. I remember it was an ugly thing, whatever it was, and it was probably just some 8-inch brown trout. But that was a big deal to catch it on your. I was using maybe I was using the rod that I'd made, and then caught it on a fly that I tied, and I knew that was a big deal, and I enjoyed it.
That's really cool. I like that story. How were you fishing those streams? Were you swinging down and across spiders and wet flies?
Yeah, mainly swinging down and across, because that's what I knew from river stuff, and being around Alec, and that's what I generally saw. We weren't really nymphing at all. I didn't understand that in rivers at that time. Everything was, swinging wet flies was the tradition of the North Country, tea, prit, that type of thing. So that's what was really driven me. I'd had a couple of days up on the River Wharf at Bolton Abbey where I think we'd gone up as a family trip to go walking or something, and I begged and pleaded, and my folks said, okay, you stay by the river and fish, and we'll go for a walk. And I did that, and that's, of course, that's classic swinging North Country spiders, so that had a lot of influence on me as well.
I've never fished the Wharf, but it looks absolutely stunning. I've fished the Ewer, I know that a little bit, in Driffield, but there I've not fished, and it just looks wonderful water to fish, but really photogenic, beautiful setting as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Bolton Abbey section was becoming very busy because it's quite the tourist attraction. So if you found a really wet, ugly day, that was a great time to fish it because there wouldn't be many people around. But yeah, I mean, for swinging wet flies and targeting browns on dry flies, I really loved it. Coming from the River Ryburn, it was Mecca. So I loved it, and I have some very good memories of catching. Obviously there was mainly stockfish, but some really beautiful fish, and I greatly enjoyed fishing it, and learned a lot from fishing it.
And so we're talking, you're around 12, 13, you're tying your flies, you're fishing still waters, you're fishing rivers. School, the finishing of school isn't a million miles away. What happened then when you left school? Did you go to university, college, anything like that? Or what was the next
Yeah,
step?
I went to college in North Wales. But growing up, when I hit my mid-teens, I had two competing passions. One was climbing and one was fly fishing. Certainly through my late teens, early 20s, the climbing side of things really took over. Living in North Wales, it was a center of, whether it was Gogarth or Cloggy or Llanberis Plas or Traumatic, there was so much climbing. And I would certainly still fish. There was some good access to water there, and I would fish when I would come home. But climbing really took over through that period. So as happens with most anglers at that time, chasing girls, BF climbing, they sort of won over for a little while, but it was always there, and I was always tying through all of that.
And then I guess not long after you graduated that you ended up in the US, and that passion for climbing became even greater. So you become a climbing guy, is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, in my late teens and early 20s, climbing was, let's just say, it was pretty hardcore and pretty passionate. When I remember graduating from college, I didn't go to graduation. I went straight down to the Alps, spent the summer in the Alps, spent the fall in the Himalaya climbing, and then got back in December and found my work papers had come across through from the US. I'd been offered a job as a climbing guide. I was a good climber at these times, and I was offered a job as a climbing guide in a school in North Conway. And so I literally had 2 weeks back in Britain, jumped on the plane, flew to the US, and then my full-time occupation was a climbing guide, and my work permits, I was an H1, which meant I was a specialist in my field, but I wasn't allowed to transfer to anything. So the only way I could make money was to work as a climbing guide at that particular time.
And how does that, not knowing anything about it, how does that work comparable to, say, like a fishing guide? Do you, and I guess I'm talking more about it over from this point of view, from the UK point of view, that generally the route you go, not always, but the route that you go is get a qualification, you get this, you get that, or if you're let's say a dive instructor or something like that, is it a similar sort of thing? Do you need to get a qualification, or how does that work from a client?
You do. In Europe, there's the IFMGA, and in the US at that time, we were moving into the AMGA, the American Mountain Guides Association, and I was actually one of the first guides to be certified in that process, which was rather ironic because I was a Brit. I was the first Brit to go through it, but it was all in the early stages then. But I had a education in it coming from a college where the John Brailsford, who ran the program, was the president of the British Alpine Guides previous to that. So I got a job, came over. unlike fishing guiding, the interesting thing about climbing guiding is that you do, fishing, you don't fish as a guide. You help your clients and you do that. Climbing, you do climb. So I would have a great time because I would have everyone from a beginner to, hardcore experts who wanted to climb really hard stuff. And you would always be climbing. And it's just like fishing guides. You really get to know the people that you're working with. You're really invested to make them better at what they do. And it's all about the people. It's not about the climbing. And I just loved it. For the 10 years that I did it, it was the best job I've ever done, still to this day. And it got me all around the world. And I would usually pack a fly rod so I could be fishing for trout in Peru or Canada or the Himalayas as I was doing my travels. And in where I went to North Conway, it would be ice climbing all winter, rock climbing all summer. Then you'd either be on Denali or you would be in the Himalayas in the spring or the fall. So it was, for somebody in their mid-20s, it was a great lifestyle.
And was it stressful at all? Because, having been a fishing guide for 16 odd years, worst case, somebody might ship some water or lose a fly in a tree. But obviously with climbing, it's slightly different. Is that, I suppose in your 20s, you don't get stressed about stuff like that. But, things can go wrong and potentially and be quite dangerous.
I mean, it can be for certain. The majority of what you're doing is beginner to medium level climbing. And so there's certainly objective hazards and things, but the level of the activity that you're doing is so low below your base level, below your comfort level, that I never felt particularly stressed about it. Certainly doing something very hard with a client, you would have to value things very carefully. And there was certainly, it's climbing, it is dangerous, but it is something you're doing all the time and you become very comfortable with it. And you're very confident in it because you are doing it all the time. But for me, when I arrived, I knew none of the climbs or none of the areas. So every time I guided a hard route or something, it was always my first time on that route in the first year or so, which was always quite exciting. But, I loved it. I loved the people that I met. I loved seeing them. There's very few jobs, fishing's guiding's the same, but there's very few jobs where someone walks up to you at the end of the day, shakes your hand and says, wow, that changed my life. That was the best day of my life. That made such a difference to me. It's very gratifying to have that and for people to share that experience. And now I haven't guided in decades, but I'm still friends with some of those people. They come up to me. We still communicate, and they're an important part of my life.
Wow. And do you still climb?
Still climb a lot, yes. I mean, in the winter, I'm ice climbing all winter long on the weekends. That's what I do because you can't fish here in the winter. When summer comes, fishing takes over a lot, but I still rock climb a bunch. And that allows me to go into places like the Wind Rivers where I can go in, camp and fish rivers and climb mountains all in one way. I mean, there's definitely a strong connection between climbing and fishing, whether it's, if you look at Joe Brown in Britain or Yvonne Chenard in America, there's something that connects the two at some level.
I think it was interesting because I was going to mention, I think I've mentioned it in another podcast, the film about the guy who climbs El Capitan, free climbs it. And you felt a sort of an affinity with a trout bum type community.
Oh, absolutely. I think climbing and fishing have that. The climbing bum mentality is much more of a bum mentality. I mean, we were able to be really dirtbags back in the day. My car, when I arrived in America, when I spent $400 on a Toyota Celica, traveled all over America, that you just put your mat down in the dirt and sleep in the dirt, and that's how you would live. When you weren't working, when you were touring, and it was great fun. And certainly in America, trout fishing or fly fishing has that same connection as well, where you live out of the back of the truck and you go fishing. I think not quite as hardcore as the climbing side of things, but still pretty hardcore. Nowadays, all of it's a little disrupted with everybody driving around in $100,000 Sprinter vans and saying they're dirt bagging. Yeah. But that's a different story. But back in the day, I would say that between the core people in the fishing and the climbing world, there was, lifestyle was very much the same. Instead of climbing mountains, you were casting a fly rod, but the way that you lived was very much the same.
We're going to take you back because there's something that's eating away at me since you mentioned it. And you said climbing in Peru, and then you mentioned trout and Peru. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, we would go into, the Santa Cruz Valley, and we would climb in peaks like Alpamayo and Atasarahu and things like that. And you'd have a small base camp in a low pasture, and then from that base camp you would go up into the mountains to climb your peak. There might be a 2-day peak, it might be a 3-day peak, whatever. But most of these valleys had streams going through into these beautiful lakes. I never had the equipment to fish the big lakes because they were big, deep blue lakes. But all these little streams had small brown trout in them, and they weren't big. Wasn't like fishing down in Argentina. They were 8-inch brown trout, but a few of those for dinner was quite nice.
Yeah, and where do you think they came from? Were they transplanted there from somewhere or other?
They must have been. I can't believe that they weren't. I don't know the background of it. Certainly it's not a destination place like Argentina is at the moment, but there were small little trout there and they were fun to catch.
Yeah, it's the weird stuff that really interests me, and Bhutan's always been on my my bucket list to go there. Have you been out there, I guess, climbing and
not Bhutan? I mean, Nepal was my hotbed of work and play, but I'd love to go to Bhutan as well.
Yeah, there's so many wonderful places, and it's the not so well known places that sometimes, to me at least, are the most interesting as well.
I think so. I mean, I love going out west and fishing the big rivers and the big names, but there's so much to explore here on the East Coast that I think most Brits aren't even aware of, don't even know it exists. And then you look at Quebec, which is above me, the the province of Quebec, from the border with the US north to its top, is the same distance from the northern border of the US all the way down to the tip of Florida. It's this massive, massive landmass full of fish and no people. And, barely anybody goes up there. There's so much potential over here.
Wow. And do you tend to head up into those areas from time to time as well and go fish?
I love to chase salmon. Right from an early age, salmon were in my blood. I could never really fish for them in Britain because I could never afford it as a kid. But I remember on holidays at Gairloch, we'd fish the river below the bridge because we were told if you fish below the bridge, you could fish for free because it was tidal, and we did, and nobody kicked us off, and it was fun. But over here, I love to go up to the Gaspé and fish. I do fish the Miramichi and Cascapedra and things like that. Miramichi's in New Brunswick, but my favorite place to go is the town of Gaspé and fish the York River, the Dartmouth, and the Saint John. And for me, it's absolutely magical. I mean, the water in the York River can be crystal clear. You can see down to 20 feet. And you're watching these huge salmon in there. It's all accessible. You don't need a guide. Pricing is very inexpensive. So very much a DIY trip. And the people are so friendly, and you're so far from everything that I just love it. And it's easy access.
And they take dries as well, the salmon.
They take dries, and that is really fun to watch and do.
Yeah,
just don't have a heart condition because it might put you over the edge.
I know. I think that you're just ticking all my bucket list places off by what you're mentioning, and it's making it even worse for me, particularly at the moment where we can't fish as well. So it's kind of it's just fantastic to hear. But that Gaspé has been on my radar for quite some time and just looks absolutely phenomenal. But so you're living in the States. Was it a long term? Obviously, we're in 2020 now, and you're still in the US. But at the time, was it something that you planned? Was there a time when you realized the US was going to be home for you?
Well, finishing college in North Wales, I came from Soberbridge, Ripon area. I think in the Halifax area there, the unemployment rate when I was graduating college was something like 15 to, I can't remember, but 15% or something. It was huge. And I didn't want to pursue, I wanted to go adventure and things and so forth. So I'd written all these letters to schools in America, climbing schools and operations guide services to try and get a job. And I did get one, and I got legal work permits to come into the US. I arrived there on December 17th, I think, taught ice all winter. And after about a month, I knew I was never going back to the States. I would do everything, back to the UK rather. I would do everything I could to stay in the States because the opportunity, I hadn't even seen the fishing yet, but just so much space, so much potential. We didn't have the internet, so I couldn't go exploring things on the internet, but just from where I was working, there was just so much open space and opportunity, and people were very pro supporting people who would just try and make their living. There was a lot of negativity back in Britain when I left, and none of that was in America. So it was just wide-eyed and go for it, which I loved. And then when I discovered, after my first winter teaching ice, I was teaching rock climbing, and to drive to the cliff where we'd take people climbing, I would cross the River Saco. And once the roaring runoff had gone through, I'd look over a very clear river. And then as we'd drive across, I'd peek over and I could see trout rising. So, I've got to get in on this. So I went to the fly shop and said, I need a license for the section of river down here. And they went, great, $15. And I went, great, thanks. Now, how far can I fish? Is it a mile up here and a mile down? Then it goes, no, that's for the whole state of New Hampshire. You can fish anywhere in New Hampshire for that. And that was like, whoa, that was a big eye opener. And so suddenly the world was very different from the type of fishing that I had in Britain. And, it just opened up so many opportunities. And I became good friends with a guy called Bill Frank, who was a rod maker in North Conway. And he just explored, showed me the area, took me salmon fishing up on the Penobscot in Maine. I'm one of the very few people that's actually caught an Atlantic salmon in the USA, which I did on the Penobscot, which was a great moment for me.
Oh, fantastic. And so were you doing a lot of that then? That fishing suddenly came back into your life in a much bigger way, where it's sort of been pushed to the background a bit by climbing and stuff, and then fishing, you're suddenly thinking, wow, this is great value for money. I can fish whenever I want and wherever I like. And it must have just been a playground then.
Oh, total playground. I mean, it tailored really well with climbing because you climb all day guiding. And in the height of summer, you wouldn't climb for recreation too much because in July and August in New England, it's very hot and sticky. So it's just not fun to be on the rocks. So you'd finish work and you'd go exploring high streams. You'd go north. You'd do all sorts. You'd go to the coast fishing for stripers. I mean, I remember the first time I went striper fishing, I can't remember seeing many people catch fish off the shore in Britain when I was a kid, especially bass. And I remember Bill saying, hey, we're going striper fishing tonight over on the Mowsam River on the coast of Maine. Do you want to come? It was about an hour and a half drive away. So I said, sure, we'll go across. And we got to the coast just as the sun was going down. There was a line of spin fishermen at the mouth of the estuary. And I'm like, damn, these guys are in the way. And Bill said, no, we'll just fish behind them. And we started casting. And we were catching 24-inch fish behind the back of the legs of these guys spin fishing. And, I was using a 7-weight or something at the time. And these fish were power trains. And that night, my first night striper fishing, probably caught a dozen fish. And that was life changing doing that. And it was all from the shore, just fishing on the coast. It was great.
And what were you fishing? Clousers and stuff like that? Deceivers?
Yeah, just clousers. That's pretty much everything.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll put it now and again, but basically, if you got a chartreuse and white clouser on, you're doing okay.
Yeah, they seem to work everywhere, don't they? And on most things as well, don't they? So let's come back again to the rivers. The reason I asked that is that you'd been fishing the rivers, I guess, around North Wales as well, but you talked about the rivers of Yorkshire. How different were you finding how you had to fish those streams in New Hampshire as comparison? Were you still swinging stuff there, or did you realise you might need to do things differently, or you didn't need to do things differently? How did you go about that?
Initially, I didn't do things too differently. I mean, we'd swing, but there was a lot more dry fly action than what I could remember. And there was quite a tight community in North Conway, which had a lot of history of fly time. Dick Stewart started the American Fly Tire, which was the big fly time magazine in America. And he started that. He lived in North Conway. His son actually became an extremely good rock climber later on. But I would definitely move away from the traditional spiders that I'd loved so much and move more into streamers. Nymph fishing was you'd start to use indicators, which is certainly something you'd never done in Britain. I think you'd have been shot if you did that. So there was a gradual change over to the American way of doing things. And it seemed very natural, and I was doing what other people were doing to work. But there is a strong tradition in New England. We used to do a lot of streamer fishing, classic streamers. So at some stage, I felt I really had to break that New England tradition, as I had broken the Yorkshire tradition, and really take a big picture view of what was on offer in America and what they were doing in Colorado or Oregon. Would that work on these rivers here? And then when I did that and brought everything into the picture, my arsenal was much stronger and I was able to do a lot more with things. And that really opened up a lot of doors.
And was that a time where you suddenly thought, wow, this fishing is comparable, it's worse, it's better, was there a moment that you suddenly thought, wow, this is the real deal, it's not what I've experienced before?
Yeah, it was definitely that, and there's so much for me was the wild aspect of it. I mean, obviously in New England, a lot of the rivers are stocked, and you wait till May and you catch a lot of trout, but that generally bores the pants off me after the first 2 days. But you look at the tribs coming out of Lake Champlain; those are initially the small salmon are stocked, but then they grow and they grow, and you're fishing these beautiful landlocked salmon, which are 5 to 10 pounds. Those are big fish, landlocked salmon, and you're catching them on a 3 or a 4 weight spay rod, swinging little intruder style patterns or things like that. It's amazing. You go to you fish steelhead with egg patterns under a bobber. Sure, that works. It's just you're catching big fish, little fish, things like bass and pike, which you just never, you have pike, but you don't have bass over in Britain like you do over here. So there was just so much new opportunity, and fly fishing now moved away from just being for trout, which is what I was sort of trout and salmon is what you saw fly fishing. And now it was just a method of fishing, no matter what the species was. And there was so much opportunity here, and everything was new. And there weren't so many restrictions and tradition that were confining to how you fish things. I mean, certainly now I have a lot of imposed traditions that I impose on myself. If I go on a small stream up in the mountains, I want to fish a dry fly. If I'm fishing for landlocked salmon, I want to swing with a spay rod. But those are self-imposed. They're not, they're not the standard traditions of the area.
Tell me about the landlocked salmon, which you've mentioned a couple of times. Are they Pacifics or are they Atlantic?
They're Atlantics.
Wow.
And they're across New England. Most Brits, I don't think, are even aware of them. The big traditional area people think about is the Rangeley and places like that in Maine, which is great fishing. You are fishing traditional streamers and you're swinging for them on a single-handed rod. There was the tradition. You're fishing with gray ghost, black ghost, things like that. The fish in Maine and New Hampshire tend to be, 16 to 20 inches, which is a good sized fish. When I moved to Vermont from New Hampshire and started fishing the tribs of Lake Champlain, I fished one particular river where it was you're fishing in an urban area. You're fishing through the center of town, and you're fishing for fish that are 20 to 30 inches long. So they're real big salmon, and they're very, very strong, and they pull and they tug like you have no one, you can't believe. So much bigger than the landlocked salmon that I was used to fishing for in Maine, very reminiscent of catching a smaller salmon up on the Gas Bay or something like that. And so just to have that a short distance from the house was fantastic.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. You mentioned there that you moved to Vermont. Was that a change in role? Was that a change of jobs? Did the mountaineering guiding stop from there, or were you still doing something from out of there? What was the change then?
Well, after doing 10 years of guiding, I basically hit around 30, and I realized I could do this forever. It's the best job I've ever done. But if I don't make a change now, I never will. So it seemed like when I hit 30, 31, whatever it was, it seemed like now was the time to make the change. And I was offered a position as a sales manager for a large climbing distributor in Vermont. So I took that. I had 2 little kids at the time, and traveling all around the world, climbing all the time was a little difficult when you got 2 young kids. So this was a more stable lifestyle, had health insurance, steady paycheck, all that type of stuff. And Vermont is a great place to bring up kids. I mean, it's a really magical place for bringing up kids. So that was one of the main reasons. So I moved to Vermont with the kids. And, it was a good change. I mean, sitting behind a desk took a little getting used to, but it was a new challenge. I was still in the outdoor industry, so I loved it.
And so did that mean having to fit time around family duties and stuff like that fishing became a bigger part than climbing, or so that you could fit a few hours fishing in rather than, I guess, if you're climbing, you go out for 5-6 hours, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, both climbing and fishing stayed. Fishing became much stronger because of the kids, but climbing was still strong. And growing up, I actually raised both my kids from about the age of 5 and 6 on my own. And climbing and fishing were just very strong parts of our general life. So we would climb and we would fish. The kids loved to climb. They were less into fishing, and I didn't push that onto them as much. So we do a lot of climbing. But for me personally, it was a lot easier to nip out and get a couple of hours on my own fishing. So my personal fishing became much more important for me because that was my personal escape. I didn't need anybody else. I could go at 4 a.m, be back at 6, 7 or whatever when the kids were waking up. As the kids got older, my son Ben never, really took the climbing route. My daughter, though, would come to the river with me, not fish, but just look and watch and enjoy being on the rocks and things, reading a book, swimming, whatever. And she loved being around it. But as I taught them both to climb, she made it very clear she didn't want me to teach her to fish. So when she was about 18, she got a plane ticket, flew off to New Zealand for 6 months and said, "Dad, can I take a fly rod?" Went to New Zealand for 6 months, bumming around, taught herself to fly fish. And when she came back, she said, "Okay, Dad, we're fishing now." And now she's become, when she's around and when she's not traveling, we're a very strong fishing partners.
Oh, what a dream.
Yeah, it was good.
That sounds amazing. It's interesting to me, the US, from what I see and what I hear when I'm there, the family sort of fishing dynamic seems more in place than the UK. I'm probably wrong, but I sense that more so. Do you think that's a fair comment? Or
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I know when I was a kid, I can't remember my parents ever being particularly, and they were very supportive, but nobody ever came to a rugby game I played. Nobody, people would drop me off fishing, but nobody would fish with me. Where over here, there seems to be more involvement of that. Friends that I have, certainly, if their passion is mountain biking, or if it's climbing, or if it's fishing, they really include their kids in that. Some of them perhaps push it a little hard sometimes, but most don't. And it just becomes the family way of doing things. And that's the memories that those kids have as they grow up.
I get that sense when I go to Yellowstone, for example, the camping trip with fishing involved with that, and everything else that goes with it, which I'm sure it goes on here, and I'm probably oblivious to it, but it seems much more clearer there, I have to say.
I think so. And it's simpler because licenses are cheaper. You can fish more water. It's a simpler process to do. You have a state license, and you can, if I'm in Vermont here and if I had 2 young kids, we have a plethora of really nice state parks. We could go and stay at those state parks, and on the same fishing license, we could fish any of the water that those parks provide. We could camp, we could boat, we could ride our bikes. So it's a very inexpensive family option in a beautiful environment, and we have a lot of it.
I'm going to take you back a tiny bit because there's another species that you mentioned. All these cogs are whirring in my mind about all these species that I don't know so much about. Bass, and I don't mean the striped one, the inshore largemouth, smallmouth, whatever it is. Tell us a little bit about those and how you chase those and where you would chase those.
Well, I mean, the smallmouth bass, which is largely what is around me, is an incredibly aggressive, fat pig of a fish. It has a mouth that is huge. I mean, you can stick your fist down a good sized one's no problem at all. They're very aggressive. They're often surface orientated. You can fish for them either in large rivers. I'm on the banks of the Connecticut River here, close large river, and we can fish for those in the river, swinging streamers, pulling streamers, popping poppers sometimes. But probably the most popular way of doing it is fishing lakes or ponds where you're in a boat, float tube, or on the bank, and you're casting out a popper and you're popping it across the surface, and it'll glug, 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 and then the water will explode and this big bass will come out and inhale it. Very strong fish, much stronger than a trout, very aggressive. You'll get a lot of air out of them. And when you land them, you just lip them. You can put your thumb in their mouth and just lip them and release them. So very aggressive. You're not particularly selective. Basically, if you put the streamer or the popper in the right place, there's a good chance of you catching a fish. So it's very visual. Tends to be a lot of them, and it's great on warm days because they're a warm water species. So when the trout go down because the temperatures are getting too hot and we don't want to hit the rivers, the bass fishing comes up because they love the warm weather. So then they're really on, and so they balance out nice with trout. So you don't have to select one over the other. You just choose the appropriate one at the time of the year, and it's the super aggressive fish and fun to watch and catch.
And if you're looking at them, if we're looking at fishing as a whole in the US, I guess even fly fishing there is a small part of it comparable to a species like bass is what I sense anyway.
Yeah, I mean, fly fishing is tiny. It's a small industry. I mean, really it's a small industry, but a fun industry. I enjoy working in it. It's very much deals done on a handshake, and you're friends with people that you work with. The bass thing is a huge thing. I mean, people are powering around in competitions on $60,000 bass boats, being pulled by a $50,000 truck, all this type of stuff. So it's a real deal, and they're fishing generally very large bodies of still water. And it's a big industry and gets a lot of following. It's not something that I particularly, follow or play in or anything, but it's impressive to see what they've done. And we have so much water here and such big bodies of water. And these guys that fish, I mean, they're really state-of-the-art anglers. They very, very much know what they're doing. I mean, some of them are making their living totally doing that, and are making a very healthy living doing it.
Because some of the prize money is huge, isn't it?
I mean, we're talking six figures, boats and things. So there's real money to be made, but because real money draws a lot of competition, so you have to be really good to make it work. And some of these guys are really good.
Mm. And you mentioned there that you work in the fly fishing industry now, which I said at the very beginning. How did you move from climbing into fly fishing? How did that come about?
Well, after I stopped guiding, I worked in the outdoor industry for a long time, both in the climbing, and then I ran a company called Gilbo, which is a French sunglass company. And then when I hit my 50s, I was getting a little disillusioned with the outdoor industry. It was becoming very big business type stuff. It wasn't the friendly deals on a handshake stuff that I remembered. And I've always been a passionate fly fisherman and love fly tying, love fishing. Always wanted to move into that side of it because, again, I realized I don't want to finish my work years out in the outdoor industry. I want to move into something new. Fly fishing is what I wanted to move into. A passion for flies. The opportunity came to work for Fulling Mill, which was, I didn't have to move too far south. I did relocate, but I only relocated an hour and a half away. And it was a great challenge, and it's a great company, really knows what they're doing. And it got me into the industry, and I've only been in the role for 2 years now, but it's been a fascinating experience. And it's a lot like the outdoor industry was probably 30 years ago, where you meet people, everything's done on a handshake. Everything's done on the relationship. You have to deliver a good product on time. But, if you get on well with somebody, you'll probably get their business and you'll probably have a good relationship. And most of the business is done on the river with a fly rod in your hand, which is not so bad.
That sounds very, very civilized way to do things. Tell me if we could have a look inside, as a fly, how does the process work from somebody submitting a fly to it becoming to production? Because, I suppose you must be sent thousands of flies by people saying, well, this really works on this creek or this river or whatever. How does that process work from a point of view from somebody submitting you a fly and saying, and it going into production? How does that process occur?
Yeah, we get a lot of flies submitted. The way that it basically works, we need a tyer to submit 3 ties of the same fly. They need to be submitted in February, before the end of February. Then Eric Kelly, our technical manager, goes over to Africa where all our tying is done. We own our own factory over there. We have about 200 tyers over there. And then he will sit down with a certain group of tyers there and teach them how to tie those particular flies. So basically make counter samples. He will stay in Africa for about 2 weeks working with tyers on various projects. Then he will come back to the US, and those counter samples will go out to the tyer. So whoever submitted the fly and say, this is our rendition of your fly. Are you comfortable with it? Generally, they say yes. So they might say the body's too heavy, the tail's too long, and then we'll make adaptations. Those can nowadays often be done over Skype with our tyers in Africa. And then we'll get other counter samples. And then once the counter samples are signed off on by the signature tyer, they will then go into the catalog for the following year. So basically, if you submit something in February, we decide to take it, counter samples go through, you will hit our fall catalog. So if you did it for 2020, it will go into the 2020 catalog, which will be the all the catalog all the way through 2021. And like that, and then they'll be paid a commission on any sales of flies that are sold, as long as it's in the catalog.
What makes you, though, decide to take that fly on? Do you fish a version of it? Is there something about it that you think, yeah, this fits in with our lineup and it would work really, really well? Is there a sort of is there something that makes you think, yeah, this one looks like the real deal, comparable to, say, a run-of-the-mill type thing?
Well, a lot of it comes down from who is submitting the fly. So, for example, if it's Cheech or Curtis from Fly Fish Food, who are signature tires for us, I mean, their track record in producing really good flies that sell really well. I mean, we're going to take most of the flies that they submit because they're of such a high standard. Then Eric really has to go through. We may have times when we're really trying to bump up the saltwater collection. So we will put out calls to various tires whose flies we want, and we'll say, look, guys, we're looking to update our bonefish collection of flies. You're the expert in this field. What are you using? What should we use? Are you interested in being a signature tire? So we will target people like that. We had a lot of success with that with our Euro nymphing flies, which do very well for us in the US. And then we'll have other people just submit flies, and they need to give us a history on why they're submitting and what they're doing. Eric, our technical manager, is very good at what he does and can really, weed through that. And it has to fit. If we got 60 different versions of a Euro nymph, we perhaps don't need 65 unless it's phenomenal. And then we need to know why it's phenomenal. So we'll weed them out, and everybody's tying a variation of a Euro nymph now. And we get a lot of submissions. And, there's not a lot to a Euro nymph, and there's not a lot new coming out of that at the moment. So, at the moment, it's saltwater flies that we're focusing on because we're really upping our game in that market, in the US, for example.
And what is the number one fly? What is the consistent one? Would it be the Parachute Adams or something like that?
Nope. It would be the Duracell, followed by a Spanish Bullet. And as of year to date this year, the Parachute Adams does make top 10, but usually it comes in about 15 to 20. So the Euro nymphs have really taken over, not necessarily fished as a Euro nymph as you and I would fish it. But for example, in Montana, people have really worked out that things like Spanish Bullets and Perdigons work great on a hopper-dropper setup because they sink so quickly and get right down. So a lot of the Montana guides, for example, are not Euro nymphing at all. They're doing the classic dropper hopper setup that they do in Montana, but they're using Perdigons and other Euro nymphs as that dropper because it works so well.
It's interesting you mentioned the Duracell. That's Craig McDonald's fly, and that's just a phenomenal fly, isn't it? I love it. I use it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it's between that and the Spanish Bullet pretty much every year at the moment. What's the top seller?
Wow, that's fantastic. And I assume when you're testing out these saltwater patterns, you have to go on these trips and help test them, I guess.
Not as much as we would like. Unfortunately, saltwater in particular, trout ones are easy to do. When we do saltwater flies, we're very vigilant to use the core angler from that core activity, whether it's tarpon, whether it's bonefish, whether it's a particular location. So we want to be very particular about that. So although we would go out and cast them and test them, we'd only be playing in the game because we'd be there for a week. So we want the angler from that location, that guide who fishes there all the time, and these are his bread and butter flies.
That's really, really interesting to learn a little bit about the process. What for you is, what does fly fishing feel like to you right now? And, we're in the UK, I'm sure you're probably up to speed with there's people talking about declining numbers of participants and I've my own theories about those, which I won't bore people with because I talk about them a lot. But how's it in the US right now? Is it a similar sort of thing, or are you getting more people? Because it's still seen to me like Scandinavia, the US is seen as a super cool pastime. How does it feel to you, and how is it looking right now?
For me personally, I'm like a kid. It's as passionate about it now as I ever was. I just can't get enough of it. Last night I was fishing in a snowstorm, freezing my butt off, caught no fish, and was happy as could be. I think in the US, we're seeing a good young population coming in because it's regarded at a certain level as a hipster cool sport to do. So that brings in a young crowd. There are a lot of young, passionate anglers. Fly tying, this is the age of fly tying. It's not going to get any better. The amount of information that is shared online, the standard of person that's tying, the material that you can buy. A lot of people are tying really, really good flies, and a lot of those people are young people. I think they like the adventure aspect of fly fishing. Fly fishing has that sort of aspect of being adventurous without having to kill yourself in the process. So you can have an adventure in the Wind Rivers, you can have an adventure in Wyoming, be in the outback, be lost in the woods fishing away, but you're not halfway up a cliff face where you're likely to get into serious trouble. So it's a portal into the outdoors for a lot of people. It may not be their only passion into the outdoors. And then with the more aggressive sports, whether it's running or mountain biking or something, it's a great, if you've been on a bike all day, then you go and put your legs in a cold river all evening. It's a nice combination. I think social media has opened it up to a lot more younger people to know that it's at least out there. That has its good and its bad, but at least people know it's out there now and they can learn about it quickly. They don't have to go to grandpa and learn the old way of doing it. They can get the latest techniques quickly, and there's a lot of passion and excitement. And if you look on the YouTube channel and Instagram, generally people are pretty positive and excited and looking to share knowledge, and so there's a positive vibe about it, which I think is just generally good.
How do you feel, because social media is, as you say, seeing some of the pictures, some of the films on YouTube and everything are just phenomenal, done by these super cool guys. I watched something the other day, I can't remember, about a guy fishing in New Zealand, and he retraced the steps. He's a young guy, a Scandinavian guy, and followed the steps of a guy he'd found his journal and followed the rivers that he'd fished in New Zealand, and then tracked the guy down. And it wasn't always as it seemed, but it was just beautifully and cleverly put together. Do you wish you had that when we were fishing, social media in that way to share and spread things? Would you wish you had it then?
Me personally, no, because I had such a good, I loved the way that I came up through it. I could have certainly learned things and got a lot better faster. But, I enjoyed everything that I did. I enjoyed the lifestyle that I had. If I'd had a regular core mentor that I'd be fishing with, or if I'd had social media, I would have been certainly better earlier. But it was all a journey. And for me, it's the journey. It's not the goal. It's not the end. It's the journey that's important, whether it's climbing, whether it's fishing. It's the journey. And I'm still on the journey. And now I'm certainly milking the living daylights out of all that social media information that's out there and using it as much as I can. And I'm just a sponge sucking it all up. But I didn't need it to come into my life any earlier. I'm glad to have it now and make the most of it now and just feed off it. And I'm 12 years old, really.
Nice. Let's get geeky for a sec. What's your Hall of Fame piece of tackle? What's that thing that you love to fish with? What's that thing that you couldn't be without? What is it?
Well, in the big picture, nothing, because I'm very much about the experience and not the fishing. But having said that, my CF Berkheimer 13 foot 4 7-weight spey rod is probably my, I just love loading that thing and flinging that line out there. So for big fishing, that would be the model, the rod. For small trout streams, my Scott G 7'7" 2-weight is like just beautiful. And then for chasing stripers, my Loomis 9-weight, 9 foot 9-weight is the rod to go for.
Looks like you got every base covered there with nice
Try
stuff.
to.
Yeah. So if you could, where's your one favorite place that you love to be where you feel all is good with the world?
A small brook trout stream high in the White Mountains with nobody around.
That sounds about perfect to me. Is the US home to you now? Do you think you'll ever come home?
I could never live back in Britain. I don't think. I love going back for a week holiday. A week's enough. I don't need more than that. This is my home. I'm an American now.
It looks as though the listeners can't see, but I can see Nick on the call here. And like he says, it is literally a log cabin. And it just looks about as somebody who's got their life pretty well sussed at the moment. Is there somewhere you would like to visit that you haven't? Where have you got? You've ticked all my bucket list places at the moment, but is there somewhere that you haven't visited within the US and out of the US as well that you'd love to go to?
Ooh, good question. In the US, I think I would really love to hit some of the very remote western Wyoming rivers that nobody really goes to, fishing for trout, to do that. That would probably be the highest in the US. Outside the US, there's so much in Canada that I would love to explore. I'd love to explore Scandinavia. I've never fished in Scandinavia. And places like Croatia would be really high on the list as well. So those types of places, I think.
And do you think do you actively look at those, or is it a case that you've got sort of pretty amazing fishing on your doorstep that it may be something you get around to ticking?
Oh no, I'm doing this stuff. I mean, I love it, and I realize life is short, and you got to make, you want to look back and say I did that, not go, oh, I wish I'd done that. It's like, steelheading in British Columbia. It's expensive. I couldn't really afford to do it, but God, I'm going to do it because I don't want to regret not doing it. And with my work now, anywhere in America, I travel a lot for work, which means I get to fish in a lot of cool places. So I'll hit all the cool places in the US that I want. I mean, recently I was in the driftless zone up in Wisconsin. And, man, what an amazing... I was fishing in a shoulder season when conditions were supposedly bad. And I just had a blast, caught a ton of fish with a great guy. Saw that there were just thousands of miles of beautiful brown trout fishing that, not that many people fish. So, opportunities open up all the time that I was never expecting.
That is another one you've ticked for in the driftless area. Was that Wisconsin or was
Wisconsin? And I would highly recommend, if you like the sort of small trout stream fishing for wild fish, nothing stocked. They're all limestone, spring creeks, sight fishing generally. But, I was Euro Nymphet at the time because it was early. And spectacular fishing, well managed by the state. So much fishing, great local fishing shop, inexpensive place to fish. But definitely, for me, that's high on the list of places to revisit.
That's been one I've been keeping an eye on, I must admit. It is difficult, I guess, when, the pull of Colorado or Montana or wherever it might be is hard to go away from. But having ticked them a little bit more now, that places like that are of great interest to me and something that is a little bit more different. Like you say, Wyoming, I fished the Snake, but that's it. And that's obviously, probably one of the main places there. But that's one that's of great interest to me. The last couple of years, I've been very fortunate enough to do sort of some DIY steelheading and have really enjoyed it. Is that something that you're into?
Yeah, I mean, I love steelheading. I mean, on the East Coast here, I'll fish the Salmon River a lot that goes into into the Great Lakes, and that's beautiful. It can get crowded, but if you know the water, you can get around the crowds. But that's got good runs of steelhead. There can be big steelhead, feisty steelhead. That's the local steelheading I do. We do have steelheading on the Lake Champlain, but it's for much smaller fish. You go to the Salmon River, you're catching fish between 6 and 18 pounds, which are real fish, and you can swing for them, which I love. But if I can get the chance to go out west, I will. I mean, the best place I think I fished for steelhead is on the Lower Dean up in BC, and that was absolutely spectacular. I've done it a couple of times, and for me, that's hog heaven up there.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, it looks as though I'm speaking to somebody who has got their life pretty much sussed. They've got life where they want it. They're enjoying every second. You're incredibly well settled. You're incredibly happy. Life's pretty good, isn't it, Nick? Yeah,
I think so. I mean, I made these decisions consciously to bring it to this point in my life. After the kids left the house and things, I downsized the log cabin, got the new job that I'm very comfortable with and enjoy. So it was all conscious decisions, and a lot of it are big steps. I mean, leaving a comfortable house and environment that you live in and a job that you do and saying, in your 50s that I'm just going to up it all and do something different. I think for a lot of people is difficult, but for me, I've made a few of those decisions through my life and I've never regretted it. But it's a big step to make, but I've been happy every time I've done it.
Fantastic, Nick. It is. We've been chatting for over an hour now, and it's been fantastic to get an insight into your life and for the listeners to get a sense of the fishing and the variety of fishing that you you have, certainly where you live, but as a country as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I know our listeners are going to find this fascinating. They're going to really enjoy, if they're buying Fly Culture as well, they're going to get a sense of where you fish, the sorts of beautiful fish you're catching. So I can't wait to put the summer edition out. So thank you for contributing to that. And thank you so much for talking to me. It's been absolutely fantastic, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Take care.
Thanks, Nick, very much indeed. Well, everyone, that is the very latest Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this one. There's going to be plenty more soon. Perhaps that light at the end of the tunnel may be coming. If it isn't, hang in there. If it is, enjoy it. Stay well, stay safe, and look out for each other. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.